Here we are on the coldest night of the year at Glen Cary Lutheran Church. It's cold out there, but it's warm in here. And welcome to our devotion. We are doing a devotion that will come for this next Sunday. It's the Sunday of the Transfiguration, and that'll be the story I'll read here in just a moment. Pastor Kristina Hill, Pastor Gary Guptill with you this morning. Hoping you're all staying warm. Do you know the Bruce Coburn song, The Coldest Night of the Year?
I don't.
It's a great song. Anyway, Google it, pull it up. Bruce Coburn, Coldest Night of the Year. It's a heartbreak song. It's a country western song, but he uses words like crystallize, and anyway. Side note on that, you got a freebie there about what music you should listen to. The Transfiguration story is an old classic theme. It actually really starts us down the road towards Lent, which comes then the following Wednesday. It's always the story just before the week of Lent. It actually wraps up Epiphany. And so I'll read it, and we'll talk about the different themes of what Transfiguration is about in our own lives and what this story is about. From Luke's Gospel, chapter 9, we've skipped a couple of chapters from last week. Here we are in verse 28. About 8 days after Jesus said these things, what he had just talked about was, in the previous section, was about picking up your cross. And those who want to save their life, they must lose it. And then he transitions into this message. 8 days after Jesus told this teaching to them, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up on a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. Two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor. Talking with Jesus, they spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment in Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw the glory of Jesus and the two men standing with him. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what he was actually saying. And while he was speaking, a cloud appeared and enveloped them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, whom I have chosen, listen to him." Now when the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was now alone. The disciples kept this to themselves, and they told no one at that time what they had seen. This is the Transfiguration from Luke's Gospel. If you know this story at all, or want to do a Bible study of your own for a moment, take Luke's version and compare it to the one that you will find in Matthew and in Mark. It's a different story. Different things take place. In this story, Jesus does not become white, as it's said in Mark and Matthew's story. And there is actually kind of a glowing event that takes place, which is always what I've understood the Transfiguration to be. In this version of it, it's a little bit different. All it says is that while Jesus was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. There's no references to white or anything that you find. It's an interesting comparison. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that today, comparing them. But as you hear this story, what stands out for you, Kristina?
Well, one thing that I think is interesting is that this story is at the midpoint, sort of Luke's Gospel. It's a turning point, right? So in the beginning, you have Jesus' miraculous birth. You have his baptism, his healings. And now that we've reached this midpoint, now we're looking ahead to his death and the cross and torture and all these other things. And so it kind of just puts Jesus' life in perspective. This one point where you see God in him. And I think the Transfiguration, this story has always confused me, but it's kind of what you'd expect a deity in human form to look like, right? Yeah. Dazzling and glowing and larger than life, and you can tell that he's this, he's full of God's glory. But when we actually see God's glory, it's when he's on the cross, and he's dirty and covered in blood and sweat and tears, and so it just kind of gives an interesting comparison to who Jesus is.
Well said. What do you make of Elijah and Moses popping into the scene?
Well, they both, have interesting encounters with God, right? So Moses, speaks to God face to face on the mountaintop, but you can't actually look at God's face, right? Because you'll die. And then Elijah, also on a mountaintop, has the experience of God in the silence. And so now it's interesting seeing them kind of again encounter God on a mountaintop, but it's in the person of Jesus. And that's all I got, because like I said, this story, I don't get it at all. What do you think is happening?
Well, it's clearly the author is making an understanding that Jesus is of the prophetic tradition of Moses and Elijah. Moses is really critical here because there's a constant reference in the New Testament over and over again, more in the Gospel of John, that Jesus is the new Moses, but those two disappear for that moment in this story. So it's like saying, yes, Jesus is prophetic. So for those of you who want Jesus to just be your friend and the forgiver of your sins, sorry, he's a prophet, also calling us to justice, to mercy, care for the poor. Jesus is of that lineage. He's not just, I have actually a book in my office. It's a fabulous book about the Americanization of Jesus and all the ways that in our American culture we've turned Jesus into seen through the lens of there's the macho Jesus of our culture where he lifts weights and then there's the handsome, rugged Jesus, and then there's the feminizing of Jesus. And well, in this story, you don't get to mess with Jesus. He is a prophet. So in the end, there's Elijah, and there's Moses, and then there's Jesus. And then there's Jesus alone in the end, which any good Lutheran will preach this text and say, in the end, it's not about us, our merits. It's not about even the prophetic voice. It's about Christ alone. There's an old story that pastors use about a young boy out in the field with his father, the farmer, and the young kid looks in the clouds and he sees the shape of the letters P and C, and the kid turns to Dad and says, "Dad, I think I have my calling. I'm called to go and preach Christ, preach Christ." And the dad turns to him, "That might be true, son, but it actually stands for pick corn, keep working." I don't know what the story is to be able to say, ultimately, we are to preach Christ as the redemption of our life. And I think in this Transfiguration story, that's where it ends. It's Christ there standing alone. And of course, the disciples act the way they tend to do. This is a great religious experience. Let's stay here on this mountaintop. And the word is, no, we're going down to Jerusalem. There's a lot of messed up people there. We still have healing to do. We still have a journey to the cross to go to. So the Transfiguration story is partly, it's a theophany. God's word speaks. It's partly connecting us to our baptism, or at least Jesus to his baptism. And then finally, I think this story is about the nature of being transformed and the constant renewal that we're called to. In the evangelical or the Baptist tradition, there's a whole emphasis on being born again. And it's a one-time experience, and then baptism happens that you're born again, you accept Jesus Christ. And we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss that concept of baptism being this born-again experience, because it is. But then it's a lifelong journey of trying to not get lulled into the systems of this world that make you complacent towards the prophetic word of Jesus as well. I think we're being called all the time to be transformed. And now, again, it's not a one-time experience, it's a lifelong journey. You were talking about your Whole30 diet. And it's a great illustration, right? You know, you went through this mountaintop experiences of getting it right, and now the diet is done and the system is over, and it's easy to go back to the stuff that you know you don't want to do. Well, we're heading into, that's why Lent is so critical, because it gives us, you know, these 40 days of Lent to say, get back on top of it. Don't get lazy again with life's transformation. So that's part of what I think this story is leading us to, as it leads us into Lent.
Well, and I think it's a good way to conclude the season of Epiphany as well, because it reminds us that Jesus Christ here in the story quite literally is the light of the world. And I was thinking of the image of like a lighthouse in a storm where things right now might not be going very well. They might be difficult and uncertain, but we have Christ alone, like you said, shining and guiding us and being our source of hope in the midst of all of this.
You know that other classic sermon illustration from pastors? If you haven't, you could use it sometime. Out in the ocean, there's two lights that appear of two ships look like they're coming at each other, and the captain of the one ship gets on. You know this story?
I know this story, yeah.
Gets on and says to the other captain, said, we need you to veer 30 degrees to the right so we can avoid each other. Please move. And the other captain goes back and says, no, you have to move 30 degrees. And the captain of the ship, who starts out the conversation, starts to get ego-driven and defensive. No, I've ordered you to move. I'm a much bigger ship than you are. And the other captain calls back and says, well, sorry, I'm a lighthouse. I'm not moving anytime soon. So, and the illustration of that is light in the midst of darkness. Don't let your own ego get too involved in that Christ is the final light of the world and doesn't change and doesn't move. So we'll end with that, is that we are heading towards Lent, and the goal of Lent is to rediscover again not ourselves as the center of all things, but Christ, who is the light of the world, is the center of our lives. And we are called to be transformed so that we may become that light as well.
Yes, and to help you with that process, if you go on our website, there are some Lent resources available to you. We have Lent Devotion for families. There's a cool calendar you can print off to mark the days till Easter. There's a bunch of other stuff. We'll also be doing a Lenten Bible study from our Tough Talk series on the subject of racism. So if you're involved in any of that stuff or interested in those, please go to our website or get in touch with one of us. We can print out a copy of the devotion for you and even hand deliver it if you want. Otherwise, you can print it out at home. Got anything else?
Nope, send us on our way.
All right. Go in peace. Thanks for being with us all today. We'll see you next time.
Good to see you, everyone.